On a Tuesday morning in September of 1962, Emmett Holloway drove his father's anvil to the county forge in the bed of a rusted Ford pickup and left it there without ceremony. He didn't shake anyone's hand. He didn't explain himself. He set it on the floor near the door, nodded once at the man behind the counter, and drove home on a gravel road with an empty truck bed and a feeling he couldn't quite name. He was 31 years old. His father had been dead for 4 months. The anvil weighed 312 pounds and had been in the Holloway family since 1887. He would not see it again for 48 years. Let me tell you about Emmett Holloway, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Both times. Not just in 1962, when he gave the anvil away, and not just in 2010, when he was asked to take it back, but in all the years between, when he didn't ask about it, didn't drive past the forge on purpose, and didn't talk about it to his sons or his wife or anyone who came to sit at his kitchen table. That silence was not indifference. It was something else entirely, and by the time this story's over, I think you'll understand what it was. Emmett was born in 1931 in Tama County, Iowa, on a farm his grandfather had broken from prairie sod in 1904. The farm was 280 acres of black loam bottomland that ran along a creek nobody had ever bothered to name, and it had been in the Holloway family long enough that the oldest fence posts were cedar, hand-split, and had been standing since before Emmett's father was born. His grandfather, a man named Cyril Holloway, had come to Iowa from eastern Ohio with a wagon, a pregnant wife, a team of Belgian draft horses, and 2 tools he considered non-negotiable: a double-bitted axe and a 312-pound cast steel anvil he had purchased from a traveling equipment broker in 1887 for $11.40. The receipt was still in the farmhouse in 1962, folded into the back of a Bible that nobody read anymore, but nobody threw away either. Cyril Holloway had been a blacksmith before he was a farmer, and he never entirely stopped being one. He shod his own horses, fabricated his own hardware, repaired his own equipment, and charged the neighbors a fair price for doing the same. The anvil sat in a low shed behind the barn on a white oak stump that Cyril had cut and cured himself, and it was the center of everything mechanical on that farm for 30 years. When Cyril died in 1934, his son Leland, Emmett's father, inherited the anvil along with the farm, the debt, and the drought. Leland was not a blacksmith by temperament, but he was a practical man, and he understood that the anvil was not sentiment. It was infrastructure. He kept it on its stump. He learned what he needed to learn. He used it until he couldn't use it anymore. By the time Emmett was old enough to swing a hammer, the forge work had slowed. Tractors had replaced the Belgian horses. Manufactured parts had replaced the fabricated ones. The neighbors who used to come to the Holloway shed for repairs had found other arrangements, or had stopped farming altogether, or had died. The anvil still sat on Cyril's white oak stump, but the stump had begun to rot from the bottom and the shed roof leaked, and the whole arrangement had taken on the quality of a monument rather than a workshop. Emmett used it occasionally, not often. He knew the basics. His father had seen to that, but he was not his grandfather, and the world he was farming in was not his grandfather's world. When Leland Holloway died in the spring of 1962, Emmett inherited the farm, the equipment, the debt, and the anvil. He spent the first 2 months settling the estate, arranging the finances, deciding what to keep and what to let go. It was a practical exercise, not a sentimental one, or so he told himself. The anvil presented a problem he hadn't anticipated. Not a financial problem, not a logistical one. Something harder to name. Every time he walked past the shed and saw it sitting there on that rotten stump, he felt the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with its 312 pounds. It was his grandfather's hands on it. It was his father's hands on it. It was every repair that had kept the farm running, every horse that had been shod, every broken hitch that had been straightened rather than replaced. It was 75 years of a family's refusal to be beaten by the things that broke. And Emmett was 31 years old and didn't know what to do with any of that. Let me tell you about the county forge, because it matters. The Tama County Community Forge had been established in 1948 by a man named Burton Schaefer, who had the idea that a shared metalworking facility could serve the farms and small businesses of the county in ways that individual farm shops no longer could. It was a practical institution in a practical county, and for the first 15 years of its existence it did exactly what Burton Schaefer had imagined. It occupied a low brick building on the south edge of Tama, Iowa, with a coal forge, a gas forge, a post vise, a swage block, and a collection of anvils ranging from a small 150-pound farrier's anvil to a massive 450-pound industrial block that had come from a railroad maintenance shop in Cedar Rapids. The forge served farmers, implement dealers, welders, and the occasional hobbyist, and it was staffed by a rotating crew of volunteers and one paid part-time manager named Gerald Novak, who had been a machinist at a farm equipment plant in Waterloo before his knees gave out. When Emmett drove the anvil to the forge that September morning, Gerald Novak was the one who met him at the door. Emmett didn't say much. He said the anvil had been his grandfather's, that it was a 312-pound cast steel double horn, that it was in good condition despite its age, and that he thought the forge could use it better than an empty shed could. Gerald looked at the anvil for a long moment, and then looked at Emmett and said, "You sure about this?" Emmett said he was. Gerald said, "We'll take good care of it." Emmett nodded and left. He drove home on the gravel road. The truck bed was empty. The feeling he couldn't name was still there. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever given something away that you weren't ready to give away, but you gave it away anyway because holding on to it felt like the wrong kind of holding on? Not grief, exactly. Not practicality, exactly. Something in between. The recognition that an object had become too heavy to carry and too important to ignore, and that the only honest thing to do was to put it somewhere it could still be useful. That was Emmett Holloway in September of 1962. He wasn't abandoning his grandfather's anvil. He was trusting it to a place where it would be used, because use was the only form of respect that Cyril Holloway had ever understood, and Emmett had understood that about his grandfather, even if he hadn't understood much else about himself at 31 years old. He didn't go back to the forge for a long time, not for any dramatic reason. Life simply moved in other directions. He planted corn and soybeans on the 280 acres along the unnamed creek. He married a woman named Harriet Webb in 1964, and they had 3 sons, Leland, named for his father, and Dale, and a third boy they called Junior, who was really named Cyril, but who had never in his life answered to that name. He bought a used combine in 1967 and a new one in 1978. He lost money in 1980 and 1981 and 1982, and nearly lost the farm in 1983, the way half the farms in Tama County nearly lost everything in 1983, and he didn't lose it, and he didn't talk about how close it had been. He watched his sons grow up and leave, and come back and leave again. He watched Harriet's hair go gray and then white. He watched the unnamed creek flood twice and recede both times, leaving silt on the low fields that was richer than anything he could have bought in a bag. He drove past the forge occasionally. It was on the south edge of town, and the south edge of town was not on his regular route to anywhere, but sometimes he found himself going that way without quite meaning to. He never stopped. The brick building sat there with its low roof line and its coal smoke smell in his parking lot that was sometimes full and sometimes empty, and Emmett would drive past it and feel something he still couldn't entirely name and keep going. Let me tell you about what was happening inside the forge during those years, because the anvil had a life of its own, while Emmett Holloway was living his. Gerald Novak managed the facility until 1971, when his knees finally made the decision for him and he moved to Waterloo to live with his daughter. The forge passed through 3 more managers over the next decade, each one competent, none of them Gerald. The facility expanded in the mid-1970s, adding a welding bay and a small machine shop, and the anvil collection grew accordingly. A 200-pound hay button acquired from an estate sale in Marshalltown, a Swedish-made petting house that a retiring farrier donated in 1976, and a handful of smaller blocks that came and went as the membership changed. The Holloway Anvil, it had come to be called that informally by the regulars, occupied a position near the main coal forge, on a new white oak stump that someone had cut and cured in deliberate imitation of the original. It was used heavily. It was used well. The people who used it knew it was good iron, and some of them knew it was old, and a few of them knew it had come from the Holloway farm, though most of those people had forgotten the details by 1985. The forge had good years and difficult years. The farm crisis of the early 1980s hit the membership hard. Fewer working farms meant fewer members, and fewer members meant less revenue, and less revenue meant deferred maintenance and reduced hours, and the kind of institutional anxiety that organizations in small Midwestern towns know very well. The forge survived the way most things in Tama County survived, by being stubborn and useful and not requiring very much. By the mid-1990s, the membership had stabilized, and by 2000 it had grown again, partly because of a renewed interest in blacksmithing as a craft rather than a purely agricultural skill. New members came in who were interested in the work for its own sake. The heat and the hammer, the transformation of raw iron into something shaped by intention. They were younger, mostly, and they had different reasons for being there, and they brought the forge into a new era that Burton Schaefer probably wouldn't have entirely recognized, but probably would have approved of. The Holloway anvil continued to be used. It was, by the consensus of everyone who worked at the forge, the best anvil in the building. The cast steel had a ring to it that the newer anvils couldn't match. A clear, sustained tone when you struck it right, the kind of sound that told you the iron was alive and the work was going well. Experienced smiths would seek it out specifically. Newer members would be directed to it when they were learning, because the rebound was right and the face was true, and 70 years of use had polished the working surface to a mirror that made the metal move the way metal was supposed to move. By 2005, the forge had a new manager, a woman named Frances Kowalski, who had grown up on a farm in Benton County and had come to blacksmithing through a welding program at Kirkwood Community College and had never looked back. Frances was 38 years old and ran the forge with the kind of organized competence that made the older members slightly nervous and the newer members deeply grateful. She cataloged the equipment, updated the liability insurance, wrote a grant that got them a new gas forge from a state arts council, and began the process of documenting the provenance of the major pieces in the collection. This last project was the one that mattered for this story. Let me tell you about what Frances Kowalski found when she started asking questions about the Holloway anvil, because it is the kind of thing that happens when someone with patience and a notebook decides to understand what they're actually in possession of. She started with the forge's own records, which were incomplete, but not useless. Gerald Novak had kept a logbook from 1948 to 1971, and in it, under the entry for September 11, 1962, she found this. Received 1 double-horn cast steel anvil, 312 pounds, donated by E. Holloway, Tama County Road, G. Excellent condition. Family piece. Original stump rotted. Good iron. That was the entire entry. Frances photographed it and kept going. She found the manufacturer's mark on the heel of the anvil, a faint stamping that read Fisher and Norris, Trenton, N.J., with a date stamp that she had to clean with a wire brush to read clearly. 1887. The Fisher and Norris Eagle Anvil. Works in Trenton, New Jersey, had been one of the premier anvil manufacturers in the United States from the 1840s through the early 20th century. Their cast steel anvils were known for a specific quality, a patented steel face welded to a cast iron body that gave them exceptional durability and a distinctive sound profile. A Fisher and Norris anvil from 1887 in the condition this one was in was not simply a good tool. It was, Frances understood, a significant piece of American industrial and agricultural history. She also found, through the county assessor's records and a conversation with a retired extension agent who had known the Holloways for 40 years, that Emmett Holloway was still alive, still farming the same 280 acres along the unnamed creek, and still living in the farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1908. He was 79 years old. His wife Harriet had died in 2003. His son, Leland, had taken over the active farming operations, and Emmett spent his days doing what old farmers do when the work is no longer entirely theirs: watching, advising, maintaining the things that needed maintaining, and sitting on the porch in the evenings with a glass of iced tea and the particular satisfaction of a man who has done what he set out to do. Frances Kowalski drove out to the Holloway farm on a Wednesday afternoon in April of 2009. She had called ahead, which Emmett had appreciated, and he met her on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea already poured, which she appreciated in return. She told him what she'd found: the logbook entry, the manufacturer's mark, the date stamp, the history of Fisher and Norris, the significance of the piece. Emmett listened without interrupting. He had the quality that old farmers often have of being able to listen to a long explanation without showing what they think of it until they're ready to say. When Frances finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My grandfather paid $11.40 for it." Frances said she knew. Emmett said he kept the receipt. Frances asked if she could see it. Emmett said he'd have to find it, but he thought he knew where it was. He found it the next day, still folded in the back of the Bible nobody read, and he mailed it to Frances with a note that said only, "In case it's useful, E. Holloway." Frances had it framed and hung it on the wall of the forge next to the anvil. That was 2009. The conversation about what to do next took longer. Let me tell you about the year between Frances Kowalski's visit and the morning she drove back out to the Holloway farm, because it was not a simple year, and the question she was carrying was not a simple question. The forge's board of directors had discussed the anvil at 3 separate meetings. The discussion was not contentious exactly, but it was careful in the way that discussions about objects of genuine significance tend to be careful. Some members felt that the anvil's value, historical, practical, symbolic, was best preserved by keeping it in active use at the forge, where it had been for 48 years, and where it continued to serve the community it had always served. Others felt that the original donation had been made under circumstances that deserved reconsideration, that a 31-year-old man settling his father's estate was not necessarily in a position to make a permanent decision about a 75-year-old family heirloom, and that the Holloway family ought to at least be offered the choice. Frances herself had a view, which she kept mostly to herself during the board discussions, but which she had formed clearly during the months she spent researching the anvil's history. Her view was this: the anvil had been given in good faith, had been used in good faith, and had served the county well for nearly 50 years. It was not the forge's place to simply give it back. That would be presumptuous, and it would also deprive the membership of something genuinely irreplaceable. But it was the forge's obligation to tell Emmett Holloway what they had learned, to show him what they had documented, and to ask him, directly, plainly, without pressure, what he wanted. Not what was practical, not what was legally correct, what he wanted. Because the anvil had been given in a moment of grief and uncertainty by a man who was now 79 years old and had lived long enough to know his own mind, and he deserved to be asked. The board agreed with her in the end. The vote was 7-1, and the one dissenting member later said he had voted no on principle but had no objection to the outcome. Frances drove out to the Holloway farm on a Thursday morning in March of 2010. It was cold and clear, the kind of early spring day in Iowa when the fields are still brown and the sky's a particular shade of pale blue that makes everything look both fragile and permanent. Emmett was in the kitchen when she arrived, and his son Leland was there too, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the careful stillness of a man who has been told something significant is about to happen and has decided to let it happen without interfering. Frances sat down and put a folder on the table. Inside the folder was the logbook photograph, the manufacturer's documentation, the provenance research, the framed receipt photograph, and a letter from the forge's board of directors addressed to Emmett Holloway. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph summarized what the forge had learned about the anvil's history and significance. The second paragraph said simply that the forge would like to offer Emmett the opportunity to take the anvil back, if that was what he wanted, with the forge's gratitude for 48 years of use and the acknowledgement that the original donation had been an act of generosity that the forge had perhaps not fully understood at the time. Emmett read the letter twice. He set it down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Leland watched his father and didn't say anything. Frances watched them both and didn't say anything either. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the furnace running and a crow outside in the bare cottonwood tree by the driveway. Then Emmett said, "My grandfather would have thought this was foolishness." Frances waited. Emmett said, "He didn't keep things for keeping's sake. He kept things because they worked. The minute something stopped working for him, he found somewhere it could work for somebody else." He picked up the letter again and looked at it. He said, "You've been using it?" Frances said they had. She said it was the best anvil in the building and that every experienced smith who came through the forge sought it out specifically. She said the sound of it was unlike anything else they had. Emmett nodded slowly. He said, "Cyril would have liked that." He set the letter down again. He said, "What would you do with it if I took it back?" Frances said she didn't know. She said that was an honest answer and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She said the forge would find another anvil eventually, a good one, but it wouldn't be the same and she wasn't going to tell him it would be. Emmett looked at Leland. Leland looked back at his father and said nothing, because he understood, the way sons of certain fathers understand, that this was not a question that wanted an answer from him. Emmett looked back at Frances and said, "What I want is for it to keep being used." Frances said that was what the forge wanted too. Emmett said, "Then I don't see the problem." Let me tell you about what happened after that, because the story doesn't end with Emmett Holloway declining to take his grandfather's anvil back. That would be a satisfying ending, and it would be a true one, but it would leave out the part that matters most, which is what the conversation in that kitchen produced in the years that followed. Frances drove back to the forge with the folder and without the anvil, which was where the anvil had been for 48 years and where it would continue to be. But she also drove back with something she hadn't expected to leave with, which was an invitation. Emmett had asked her, as she was putting on her coat, whether the forge ever had visitors, whether they ever brought people through to show them how the work was done. Frances said they did, school groups occasionally, and a county historical society tour once a year, and sometimes members of the public who were curious and asked politely. Emmett said he might like to come by sometime. Frances said she would be glad to have him. He came by the following month. He came on a Saturday morning when the forge was running full, 3 smiths working at the coal forge and 2 more at the gas forge, and the building was hot and loud and smelled of coal smoke and hot iron and the particular sharp scent of scale flaking off a worked piece. Emmett stood near the door for a few minutes, watching, and then Frances brought him over to the Holloway anvil and introduced him to the smith who was working it, a young man named Tobias Lindgren, 24 years old, who had been a member for 2 years and who had been told in advance that the man coming in that morning was the one whose family had donated the anvil he was standing at. Tobias stopped working when Emmett approached. He stepped back from the anvil and said, "You want to take a look?" Emmett said he did. He walked up to it and put his hand on the face of it, flat, palm down, the way you touch something you haven't touched in a long time, and stood there for a moment without speaking. The face was smooth and warm from the work. The ring of it was still in the air from Tobias's last strike. Emmett stood with his hand on the iron and looked at the manufacturer's stamp on the heel, the one Frances had cleaned with a wire brush, and he looked at the white oak stump it was mounted on, the one someone had cut in imitation of his grandfather's original, and he looked at the working surface that 70 years of use had polished to a mirror. He said, "My grandfather would have been pleased." Tobias said, "It's the best anvil I've ever worked on." Emmett looked at him. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" Tobias said 2 years. He said he'd started because he was interested in traditional craft, in understanding how things were made before manufacturing made it easy to buy them already made. He said he'd started with a cheap import anvil, and it had been fine, but it hadn't been this. And the first time he'd worked on the Holloway anvil, he'd understood immediately why the old ones were different. Emmett said, "The iron remembers." Tobias looked at him. Emmett said, "That's what my grandfather used to say." He said good iron remembers every heat it's ever taken, every hammer blow, every piece of work that's been done on it. He said it gets better with use, not worse, if you use it right. He said the worst thing you could do to good iron was leave it alone. He took his hand off the face of the anvil and looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at Tobias and said, "Don't leave it alone." Tobias said he wouldn't. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What does it mean to give something away and have it come back to you? Not in your hands, but in your understanding. Emmett Holloway drove his grandfather's anvil to the county forge in 1962 because he was 31 years old and grief-stricken and practical and not quite sure what he was doing. He spent 48 years not going back. And then a woman with a notebook and a wire brush and a genuine curiosity about the things she was in possession of drove out to his farm and showed him what he had given away and asked him what he wanted. And what he discovered, sitting in that kitchen with the folder on the table and his son watching from across the room, was that he had been right in 1962. Not accidentally right, not lucky right, but genuinely right in the way that a man is right when he acts from something deeper than strategy. He had given the anvil to the forge because use was the only form of respect his grandfather had ever understood. And the forge had used it. For 48 years, they had used it well. Every experienced smith who came through sought it out. The sound of it was unlike anything else in the building. Cyril Holloway's 1887 Fisher and Norris was still doing exactly what it had been built to do, and it was doing it better than anything newer or more expensive in the same room. That was not an accident. That was the iron remembering. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because what happened at the forge between 2010 and the present is the part of this story that Emmett Holloway did not live to see in its entirety, but that his family did. Emmett came back to the forge 4 more times in the 2 years after his first visit. He sat and watched and occasionally talked to the Smiths, and the Smiths sought him out because he was the kind of man whose silences were as instructive as his words, and because he had a way of watching work being done that made the person doing it want to do it more carefully. He brought his son Leland on the 3rd visit, and Leland stood at the anvil the way his father had stood at it, hand flat on the face, feeling the warmth of it, and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Grandpa bought this for $11. Emmett said, $11.40. Leland said, "Huh." That was the entirety of the conversation, and it was enough. Frances Kowalski used the documentation she had assembled to apply for a state historical preservation designation for the forge and its collection. The application took 2 years and was approved in 2012. The Holloway anvil was listed specifically in the designation as a significant piece of Iowa agricultural and industrial heritage, with a notation that it had been in continuous productive use since 1887, 125 years at the time of the designation, and that it remained in active service at the Tama County Community Forge. The framed receipt from 1887, the one Emmett had mailed to Frances in an envelope with a 2-sentence note, was included in the designation documentation as primary provenance evidence. The $11.40 receipt from a traveling equipment broker, written in pencil on a slip of paper that Cyril Holloway had folded into the back of a Bible, was now part of the official historical record of the state of Iowa. Emmett Holloway died in January of 2014. He was 82 years old. He died in the farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1908, in the bedroom that faced east toward the unnamed creek, On a morning when the fields were white with snow and the cottonwood tree by the driveway was bare against a pale sky. His son Leland was there, and his son Dale, and 3 grandchildren, and Harriet's sister, who was 91 and had driven herself to the farm from Marshalltown in a car that nobody thought she should still be driving. The funeral was at the Methodist Church in Tama, and the attendance was the kind of attendance that a man gets when he has lived in one county for 82 years and never given anyone a reason to speak badly of him. Frances Kowalski came to the funeral. She sat in the back row and didn't stay for the reception, but Leland saw her there and found her afterward in the parking lot and thanked her. She said she was glad she could come. Leland said his father had talked about her visit, the first one in 2009 and the second one in 2010, more than he had talked about most things in his last years. He said his father had told him that Frances had done something for him that he hadn't known he needed, which was to show him that the thing he had done in 1962 had been the right thing. Not just practically right, not just logistically right, but right in the way that matters. Right in the way that his grandfather would have recognized and approved of. Frances said she was glad. Leland said, "He told me something the night after your second visit when you came to ask him about taking it back. He said he'd spent 48 years wondering if he'd done the right thing. Not worrying about it exactly, just wondering. And he said that when you sat down at that table and showed him what the forge had done with it, he stopped wondering." Frances didn't say anything. Leland said, "That's not a small thing. Let me tell you about the forge today because the story doesn't end with Emmett Holloway's funeral, and it doesn't end with the historical designation, and it doesn't end anywhere that feels like an ending, which is perhaps the point. The Tama County Community Forge is still operating in the same low-brick building on the south edge of town. Frances Kowalski is still the manager, though she has a co-manager now, a young woman named Ingrid Petersen, who came to the forge as a member at 19 and is now 27 and runs the youth education programs that bring middle school students in twice a year to learn the basics of metalwork and understand, in the most direct way possible, that the objects in their world were made by someone, somewhere, with heat and force and intention. The forge's membership has grown steadily. The welding bay has been expanded. There is a small museum corner near the entrance with photographs and documentation of the collection's major pieces, and the Holloway anvil has a panel of its own. The logbook entry, the manufacturer's documentation, the framed receipt, a photograph of Emmett Holloway standing at the anvil on his first return visit in April of 2010. His hand flat on the face of it, his eyes on something the camera couldn't quite catch. The anvil is still in active use. It is still, by the consensus of everyone who works at the forge, the best anvil in the building. Tobias Lindgren, who was 24 when Emmett told him not to leave it alone, is now in his late 30s and has become one of the most accomplished smiths in the county. He teaches at the forge on Saturday mornings, and the first thing he tells every new student is the story of the anvil. Not the full version, not the way I've told it to you, but the essential version, that it was made in 1887 in Trenton, New Jersey, that it came to Iowa with a man named Cyril Holloway, who paid $11.40 for it, that it has been in continuous use for more than 130 years, and that the reason it sounds the way it sounds is that good iron remembers every heat it's ever taken, every hammer blow, every piece of work that's been done on it. He tells them this before they strike it the first time. He wants them to know what they're touching. Let me tell you about Leland Holloway, because he is the part of this story that Emmett might have liked most. Leland took over the farm in the late 1990s and has farmed it the way his father and grandfather farmed it. Carefully, without drama, with a respect for the land that comes from understanding that you are not the first person to have worked it, and you will not be the last. He is in his mid-60s now, and his own son, Emmett's grandson, also named Cyril, who actually answers to the name, has begun taking over the active operations the way Leland once took them over from his father. The unnamed creek still runs along the east edge of the property. The cedar fence posts are long gone, replaced twice over, but the lines they marked are the same lines Cyril Holloway marked in 1904. Leland joined the forge as a member in 2011, the year after his father's first return visit. He is not a smith by temperament, much as his own father was not a smith by temperament, but he comes in on Saturday mornings sometimes and watches the work, and occasionally he helps with the maintenance of the building, and once a year he brings a check that he writes on behalf of the Holloway family as a contribution to the forge's operating fund. It is not a large check. It is not meant to be large. It is meant to be the kind of thing that says, "We are still here, and we remember, and we are glad this exists." His son, Cyril, young Cyril, the one who answers to the name, started coming with him 2 years ago. He is 23 years old and has his great-great-grandfather's hands, wide and capable, the kind of hands that look like they were designed for work. He stood at the Holloway anvil on his first visit and put his hand flat on the face of it, the way his great-grandfather had stood there, the way his grandfather had stood there, and felt the warmth of the iron and the smoothness of the working surface, and heard, in the air around him, the faint, sustained ring of the last hammer blow still settling into silence. He stood there for a long time. Tobias Lindgren watched him from across the room and didn't interrupt. When young Cyril finally took his hand off the anvil, he looked at Tobias and said, "Can you teach me?" Tobias said he could. Young Cyril has been coming on Saturday mornings ever since. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has one more turn in it that I want you to have. In the spring of 2022, young Cyril Holloway was helping Tobias Lindgren clean and document the forge's tool collection as part of a grant project. The same kind of careful inventory work that Frances Kowalski had done in 2005 when she first started asking questions about the Holloway anvil. They were working through a storage room at the back of the building, a room that had accumulated 60 years of donated and abandoned equipment, and they came across, in the far corner under a canvas tarp, a white oak stump. Not a new one. An old one, dry and dark, with the surface worn smooth in the center where something heavy had sat on it for a long time, and with the particular density of wood that has been cut and cured and left undisturbed for decades. It was approximately 18 inches in diameter and had been cut at a height that would bring the working surface of a 312-pound anvil to exactly the right height for a standing smith. Tobias looked at it. Young Cyril looked at it. They looked at each other. Tobias said, "That's the original stump." Young Cyril said, "How do you know?" Tobias said, "Because Gerald Novak's logbook says the anvil came in September of 1962 with the note that the original stump had rotted, which means whoever received it saved the stump, and nobody threw it away in 60 years. And it's the right size." Young Cyril put his hand on the top of it, in the worn center where the anvil had sat for however long it had sat there before 1962, and felt the smoothness of it. He said, "My grandfather would have wanted to know about this." Tobias said, "Your great-grandfather." Young Cyril said, "Both of them." They brought the stump out of the storage room and cleaned it, and documented it, and added it to the museum corner near the entrance, next to the panel for the Holloway anvil. Frances wrote the label for it herself. The label says, "White oak stump, original mount for the Holloway anvil, Fisher and Norris, 1887. Likely cut and cured by Cyril Holloway, Tama County, Iowa, circa 1887 to 1904. Donated with the anvil in 1962. Preserved at the forge for 60 years. Below the label, someone, nobody has admitted to it, but most people suspect Tobias, added a small handwritten card that says only, "The iron remembers." The stump sits next to the anvil now, not under it. The new white oak stump does that job, the one cut in imitation of the original. The old stump sits beside it in the museum corner, under a small light that Frances installed to make the grain of the wood visible. People stop and look at it. Children on the school tours put their hands on it, the way you put your hand on something very old when you want to understand what very old means. Tobias tells the story of it in his Saturday morning classes, the full version, the one that starts in 1887 in Trenton, New Jersey, and runs through 1904 in Tama County, and 1962 on a gravel road with an empty truck bed in 2009, with a woman and a wire brush and a notebook, and 2010 in a kitchen with a folder on a table and a crow and a cottonwood tree, and ends, if it ends anywhere, with a 23-year-old named Cyril Holloway standing at his great-great-grandfather's anvil on a Saturday morning, learning to move iron with heat and force and intention. Emmett Holloway gave his father's anvil to the county forge in 1962 because he understood, even at 31 and even in grief, that use was the only form of respect his grandfather had ever recognized. He spent 48 years not going back, not because he had forgotten, but because going back would have meant checking on a decision he had already made, and he was not that kind of man. When they asked him to take it back in 2010, he declined because the anvil was doing what it had always done, and what it had always done was the right thing. He died knowing he had been right. Not many people get that. The forge is still open on Saturdays. The Holloway anvil is still the best anvil in the building. The stump sits beside it in the light. Young Cyril comes in most weeks, his great-great-grandfather's hands learning what his great-great-grandfather's iron already knows. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built.